what is the evidence that we're seeing, either statistical or anecdotal, that we are entering or in some kind of mental health crisis right now? I mean, what are the sort of what are the key statistics or signs that we're seeing that make us just think we're in a period that we've never seen before? Who wants to jump in with that one? Just put your hand up, panelists, if you want to. Marverine, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for asking me to be part of this panel. I can sense a movement of looking to address the abuse of journalists much more. It was only in the summer that the National Union of Journalists, which is obviously the main union for journalists, was asking for evidence around journalists who'd faced abuse, to see in what way they could take that forward, to try and figure out more protections for journalists. Only last week there was a call for harsher penalties, again by the NUJ, for repeated attacks on journalists, with the independent Home Affairs security correspondent Lizzie Dearden, who was threatened by a far-right activist, and that activist appeared at Wimbledon Magistrates Court last week. And also kind of anecdotally, but that have also been made very public, two journalist friends of mine who both work at the BBC have been publicly attacked and by kind of online trolls and what have you, with one, Ben Hunt, saying on Twitter that he's had to call the police for threats against himself and his family. Rhianna Croxford, just a few months ago, was attacked by trolls after seeing an article that was written about her in the Daily Mail, kind of trying to shoot down her, in flames, her reporting around the fact that more Black, Asian and minority ethnic people are dying of COVID-19. So reporters are routinely doing their job, are being attacked, and those reporters are publicly saying, this is not right, we need help, this should not be happening. So there's evidence that, from my point of view, what I've seen in the UK, that it feels as if it's escalating.
Hannah, did you want to say something at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I'd corroborate exactly what Marverine has said. Rhianna and Ben are amongst some of the most brilliantly talented young journalists out there, and they are vulnerable by nature of the perspectives they bring, but they shouldn't be, because they're bringing these fantastic, brilliant, diverse perspectives as well. And I think as a news organization, as a news industry, we need to give solidarity. One thing I'd say in this space, kind of coming back a little bit, is even before COVID-19, the pandemic hit, we were finding ourselves in a situation where there was almost like a perfect storm of factors. So relentless breaking news, attacks you mentioned before by authoritarian regimes or other world leaders, as it were, against journalists, a crisis of trust, falling ad revenues, people losing their jobs, online harassment, all of this stuff. So even before COVID hit, I was hearing anecdotes from people saying, we're struggling. And then COVID comes along, and not only does it do things like blur the lines between personal lives and professional lives, because we're a very sociable industry, but effectively what it does is it makes people who are more vulnerable, perhaps even more vulnerable. And what it does, and I'm sure that Anthony can talk to this specifically around the statistics, is we have seen that there are more people struggling now with anxiety and with stress and other mental health related conditions. There is some positives, and we can talk to the positives, because more people are talking about mental health in the newsroom now, right? And more people are able to get some help. But I do think that this is the real moment for a wake-up call for our news industry.
I mean, Anthony, you've been researching this and related areas for some time. I mean, are you able to give us just a bit of a perspective on what the trend line is?
So let me just start with, let me thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Let me just share some data with you. I run a research lab, and we can quantify human behavior with good psychometric measures. And I was approached at the beginning of the pandemic by Mira Selva at Oxford University, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, to say, you've got the research methodologies to do a study. Let's look at the effect of COVID on the profession. And so we were able to do that. And we got the involvement of 2 large international news organizations, and they opened up their roster of journalists to us. Close to 70% of the journalists wanted to take part in the study, which is a really important observation, because in the social sciences, to get an almost 70% response rate is very high. The typical response rate for these kind of things is perhaps 30%. So there was a hunger on the part of journalists to share their emotions with us. And we used tried and tested psychometric measures. By that, I mean, we can quantify anxiety and depression and PTSD and stress according to widely used and well-replicated tools that other research groups are using. So we can compare our data, as it were, across different centers, different research groups. And what we showed was really, I think, quite surprising, but in retrospect, perhaps not. We showed that clinically significant anxiety was affecting 25% of the journalists. So 1 in 4 journalists had clinically significant anxiety, and 1 in 5 had clinically significant depression. And the percentage of individuals who endorsed elevated psychological distress beyond what we see within the general population at a time like this approached 75 to 80%. So clearly there are a number of journalists who are struggling with their emotions at a time like this. Now, to put it in the broader context, when we look at first responders during the pandemic, like doctors or nurses, ER staff, we see a very similar picture, that the rates of anxiety in journalists covering the COVID pandemic are in fact similar to what we're seeing in first responders. And this relates to journalists who are doing the frontline work, who are going along to hospitals. They were maybe in the emergency room, an intensive care unit, speaking to relatives of those who had lost people from the pandemic. So really frontline journalism work linked to the COVID. And we saw a lot of distress in this group.
Well, thank you.
Well, it's not just necessarily that frontline work about journalists being physically in hospitals. I think it's also worth bearing in mind as well that, you know, we have the unenviable task day in, day out of reporting on what is happening in our city. So when I look at Leeds, for example, you know, my team are reporting day in, day out on the challenges that the city are facing. So whether that's navigating your way through what tier 3 means, whether that's making sense of the latest lockdown, but actually it's looking at things, for example, such as the number of hospital admissions, the number of deaths each day. You know, today, for example, we've had the sad news that Leeds has sadly reached 1,000 deaths since the pandemic started. And that really does take its toll as well on journalists, because we have that duty to report accurately what's happening. And it's our responsibility to make sure that we're holding officials to account, both locally and nationally, over the handling of this crisis. But at the end of the day, there isn't really an off switch for us. We're here, we're living this as well. And I think sometimes it's worth reminding our readers, which is something that we do quite a lot, that, you know, we're human too. It does make for uncomfortable reading, but as our profession, we can't stick our heads in the sand over this, and that will invariably take its toll too.
I think it's really important to just kind of underline what Laura said there. Anthony and I have done some work on something called moral injury, and he's much better at defining moral injury than me. But effectively what's happening in this instance is we are living the story as well. So the story is impacting us. It's impacting us in different ways. We're not all affected in the same way. But if you would imagine, for instance, my husband's from New Zealand, so, you know, the Christchurch community was badly impacted by the earthquake. The journalists there were badly impacted by the earthquake. Anthony's done work with Mexican journalists, understanding how people are impacted more when they can't just fly in and fly out of a situation. So I think it's really, really important to notice that. And I think there are some tools and tips that can be created. But Laura's point about us being humans too is so critical, because I think sometimes people look at us and think we're, you know, robots or automatons, and actually we're not.
But, you know, actually, Hannah, it's a really important point as well, in that we are trained as journalists to be that impartial person. And obviously, you know, there are those blurring of lines where, you know, we are reading much more opinion and comment. But I think it's important for audiences to realise that we are not, as you said, those automatons, that we do feel, and that oftentimes journalists will be taking those stories home with them at the end of the day, and will keep them, and will find it difficult to defrag, to relax, and to kind of separate themselves from the story. It's impossible it's often impossible, but particularly, or even more so now, during COVID-19.
And I mean, just to go back to you, Laura. I mean, just thinking about your team in Leeds. I mean, what are the I mean, how is it taking its toll? I mean, you know, we're talking generically right now about these issues having an impact, but I mean, you know, what do you see in terms of how, whether that's online abuse or just that day-to-day COVID-19 coverage, you know, how can you see in your team, you know, how that is having an impact?
I think there's two strands to this. I think the first strand is all about I think just society in general. There's that real sort of sense of, I guess, collective tension and anger that's simmering away, in that, you know, people are feeling incredibly frustrated about what's happening around them. And I think it's all too easy then to take to a tool like social media and actually vent that frustration out, especially, you know, in a world where misinformation is so readily available. And I think, you know, everyone desperately wants to try and make sense of what's going on around them. Everything feels so out of control. And I think at the end of the day, the easy targets do feel like journalists, and my team in particular. You know, we've had some pretty horrendous comments on our social media feeds, assaulting sort of like people's professional ability. So if, for example, one of my female reporters was out and about in the city centre doing a Facebook Live video, just kind of giving people a bit of a picture about what it's like under the new lockdown measures. And this reporter in particular wanted to wear a mask. And you will be so surprised at the amount of comments and the amount of abuse this reporter in particular got because she just felt safer wearing a mask. And honestly, it really spiraled out of control, and it got to the point where you just think, actually, everybody's entitled to make their own decisions. Everybody's entitled to make their own choices. And while as a news organisation, you know, you really respect that freedom of speech and the cornerstone of democracy and people being able to express their opinions, there's a really sort of line that I think gets crossed between freedom of speech and freely hating people, if you will. And it's up to us as an organisation to look at, you know, how do we monitor that and how do we help to support reporters who do bear the brunt of that. And I think, you know, the second strand, kind of going back to the question, is invariably that's then going to have a toll on the reporters, because we're not in the office. Reporters are incredibly sociable creatures by our very nature. So it's not like you've got your colleague sat next to you who's your friend to just have a moment and vent and say, oh, I can't believe this happened. It's really difficult then when you're at home and perhaps you feel a little bit more isolated for the team to be able to vent that. So I think what's been incredibly important for us as a newsroom is to make sure that that outlet is still very much there and to really draw in that sense of connectedness. And to be honest, it's a crying shame that we have to have calls to pick up on this. I mean, it is just a disgrace that somebody is being abused for simply doing the job. You wouldn't walk down the street or go into a supermarket and say, hey, I think you're stacking that shelf wrong. You think that's their job. They're the professionals, will leave them to it. It doesn't work like that for journalists.
So, Anthony, if I can come back to you, is it that we find ourselves almost in a war zone? COVID-19 is simply, you know, simply placed journalists across the board in a war zone, compared to similar to the journalists that you've studied in previous bits of research. Is that essentially what's happening here?
No, I don't like using the war analogy, but I mean, I understand why people do it. I think, you know, what Laura said is so insightful, because it also touches on what Hannah raised, which is this question of moral injury. And I think, you know, what's happening, well, let me just quickly define moral injury. It's a sense of an emotional hurt that one experiences when we view other people or ourselves committing acts that go against our deeply held moral compass. And so, you know, Laura describes this awful behavior of certain individuals when they attack journalists, and it promotes a sense of moral outrage. And it really can cause a degree of moral injury, because you're just so appalled by people's behavior, which can really become so distressing. Moral injuries associated with feelings of shame and sadness and guilt and anger. And unless you as a journalist have a very strong understanding of why you're doing this work and a deep conviction as to why you're doing it, then the sense of moral hurt can breed a cynicism, it can breed negative emotions that can chase you away from the profession or color the way you report a particular story. And so we find ourselves in this moment in time in which your profession is getting bombarded by multiple outside stressors, many of which are malign, which challenge the very fabric of what journalists are doing. And unless you have this strong conviction of why you're doing it and the importance of your work, then it can start undercutting your love for your profession, your desire to do it, can breed a certain cynicism, and one has to be so careful of that.
Thank you for that, Anthony. I guess at this point, we probably ought to point out, shouldn't we, that the impact of these issues is often disproportionately felt by some groups of journalists more than others. We've seen that kind of disproportionate impact on Black communities, whether that's COVID-19 or the protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd. Marverine, can I come to you, because you've been working with the Black Journalists Collective UK. I mean, what's the sense amongst Black journalists that these issues are particularly prevalent and amongst their members?
Thanks, Ian. Sorry, I was diving for the mute button. So there was a short-lived Black Journalists UK collective, but that said, there's obviously We Are Black Journos that Hannah Ajala runs, and I'm very connected to a lot of Black journalists in my own kind of professional networks. And the kind of common issues that are faced, and some of which I faced when I was jobbing journalist reporter. I was out on daily news at local radio level in Birmingham, BBC WM, and at TV level. So going out reporting on all sorts of stories every day. But also there is that pressure, and perhaps even more so now through COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, there is that pressure if you are a journalist of African Caribbean heritage, Black heritage, or Southeast Asian heritage. There is a pressure for you, if you are the only person of that heritage in a newsroom, there is a pressure for you to be the race correspondent, the Diwali correspondent, the Muslim correspondent, or what have you. And I know, I felt that, but I also know that anecdotally from journalists as well, in that they are keen not to be seen as that, but also there's the other side of the coin, in that if they are the only journalist of that heritage in the newsroom, that they feel they would be the best person, the best placed person to tackle a particular issue that is nuanced, where others may not see the nuance, or where they feel that their colleagues do not see the nuance in that story, or would not pull that out of a story. So there's a dichotomy, there's a kind of an inner fight for your, in terms of how you're thinking about yourself and your career and your progress. And also, I speak about the fact that if you are the only person in the newsroom, we all know the data. We should, some of us know the data from obviously RISJ and Neil Thurman's report, although, that it goes back to 2014-15, about 0.2% of journalists in British newsrooms are Black, and I think it's 0.4 are Muslim, right? So there are very few journalists of ethnic diversity anywhere in the profession across, broadcast and newspapers. Then, you kind of look at it, particularly if you're working at the BBC and you see the new directive around what you can and can't say in social media. How can a journalist who is Black not separate themselves from, it's part of their identity. So how can they kind of almost remove their identity and any feeling on a particular story when they're discussing social media? So it's, what do I say? What don't I say? Can I say anything at all? Do I not? So you're retreating into yourself in some ways. And then, because of the nature of journalism and short-term contracts, contracts and so on, and freelancers being used, the evidence shows that when it comes to jobs have got to go, then that affects disproportionately Black, Asian and minority ethnic journalists. There are forces against journalists in that sense, and I know of many across various organisations who have left the profession because they're tired of it. They're tired of the way that they have been treated unfairly or otherwise. They are retreating because of mental health and well-being issues that have come from that have stemmed from that treatment, even to the point where they're having to lean on the great support that's being offered by the NUJ if they're a member, in terms of taking an employer to tribunal, and that for me is really sad, because I've been a journalist for 17 years, and even though I'm a full-time academic, I still make content. I still produce documentaries. I don't know how I managed to do it, but you can't take the journalism out of the girl. You might be in a different, that's what I say, you might be in a different profession, but you still love it, you still like it. But when I think about the challenges that young, newly qualified, aspiring, go-getting Black journalists, the conditions that they're under, it makes me worried about how long they're going to stay in this profession when the industry needs diversity now more than ever before.
I guess, we're in an industry that is ultimately all about the end result, isn't it? It's all about the final documentary, the final feature, the news story, and everything else has to just simply serve that end product. I mean, or do we get a sense that the media organizations that we're working for or that are commissioning us, that they're beginning to get some of these pressures that are on journalists? And I absolutely take what you're saying there, Marverine, that there's for journalists of color, there's another layer of pressure, and on top of what we've already been discussing. But do we get a sense that employers, media organizations are waking up to some of these issues? Hannah, you're nodding your head, which suggests that they are.
Yes, they are to an extent. I don't think to enough of an extent. I think that Anthony has been doing work in this space for 20 years, more than 20 years. I ran a charity before joining the Ethical Journalism Network, which is my current place of work. But I ran an organisation called the International News Safety Institute, which was a journalism safety charity. And certainly, probably in the last 8 to 10 years, I've seen more of a conversation around things to do with mental health. And even more so this year, I do still think there's a degree of lip service being paid to it. I do still think that there is a sense of people talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk. And I still do think that, we cannot disassociate these issues of, diversity and inclusion, these massive issues that our newsrooms have, with the kind of the sense of they need to address mental health in a better way. Because a lot of the time what we're seeing is that we're seeing coping strategies and role modeling being pushed out by people in management that is not necessarily healthy coping strategies and not necessarily healthy management styles. And we're effectively being, I think you said at the start, we're effectively being conditioned, I suppose, to put up and shut up, and to act in a certain way that maybe was acceptable, but it never really was 20, 30 years ago. So yes. And I think the other thing I'd note in this space is that Anthony always says we're a very resilient industry. We are a resilient industry. We're not very good at admitting vulnerability either, because I think of that de facto macho image. But there has been a degree of democratization this year, partly because, all these flipping Zoom calls that we're on, not, apologies if it does no reference to this one, but there's a degree of democratization because we're all on the Zoom calls. So we haven't got the same person sounding off all the time for the entire conversation sometimes.
Anthony, do you want to, because I mean, I guess you see the world of academia and see how universities handle mental health. When you look at media organizations, are you aghast or are you seeing progress?
I mean, I do see progress. I think you're a long way behind academia. When I look at my institution, I think they take mental health very, very seriously among students now. But the study that we just completed looking at the effects of COVID on journalists was really interesting in terms of showing me how far your profession has come to some degree, because these two large international news organizations that we studied had made therapy available to journalists covering the pandemic, and 52% of the journalists had used therapy. And the group that had used therapy had significantly less symptoms of anxiety and depression and stress than the group who didn't. And we know therapy works, it makes a difference, it helps. And so for the first time in collecting data over 2 decades, I have data in real time, as it were, showing that news organizations are providing therapy at the height of a particular stress, and over 50% of the group use it and they benefit from it. And that's a huge plus, because when I think back to the very first study that I did around about 9/11, where we looked at major news networks covering war and conflict and trauma, and we showed quite a high rate of PTSD, for example, approaching frontline combat veterans, journalists were not getting any help. There was no psychological discussion on this topic. There were no resources for journalists. They just kind of swanned into war zones and came home, and the assumption was that they were fine. And we showed that there's a minority were not. So compare that to where we are now with some news organizations, and the needle has shifted quite a long way. But Hannah's right. I mean, there's a lot more work that needs to be done.
I mean, Laura, can I come to you and ask, in your experience on the ground, are most journalists at that point where they're able to, admit that they're not okay and that it's okay not to be okay? I mean, or do we have to, do journalists themselves have to move that particular needle?
I think we're incredibly lucky in our newsroom in that we do have such a close-knit, supportive team. And I think from my experience, certainly at the Yorkshire Evening Post, mental health has really been sort of a focus of what we've been looking at as a title anyway, in that we've campaigned for our Speak Your Mind campaign, which is all about making that statement to say, do you know what, it's okay not to be okay. And I think, that really sort of revolves around the conversations that we have in the newsroom, and particularly looking in terms of, I guess, like our leaders in the newsroom as well, and using the one-to-one process to really say to that individual, look, this is your time with me. And if there are any issues, don't feel like you have to wait for a one-to-one. If you are struggling, it's okay to say, do you know what, I am really struggling, because I think, it's safe to say as a profession, it's been a real struggle going from being in the hub of a newsroom that's busy, it's thriving, there's people, shouting across the newsroom as each other. It's a really, really busy place, to then come to the safety of, I guess, your spare bedroom or your kitchen table, which is where the majority of us have been working from for the last, which feels like a lifetime, quite frankly. It can feel like a really lonely and isolating place. And it's how do you strike that balance, like Hannah said, because, you can feel really overloaded with Zoom calls and hangout meetings. And actually, it's okay to just pick up the phone and say, do you know what? I am feeling a little bit delicate today, and have that conversation. And I think, that's really, really important that it's embedded in that culture of a newsroom.
I mean, Hannah, if I can come back to you, because you mentioned before the importance of leaders modeling good behavior. I mean, can you just describe for us what is, first of all, what's the wrong messages or behaviors to be modeling as leaders? What have we seen before, or even are seeing now, that just simply isn't helpful? And of course, absolutely take Laura's point that in the current situation, it's an even tougher challenge for leaders, because we're all scattered around the country, so it's even harder to maybe get a handle on what's going on with our reporters and our staff. So, I mean, first of all, what definitely doesn't work, and then what can we say in terms of leadership styles and leadership actions does work?
Sure. So first of all, I'd say my hat. If I was wearing a hat, Laura, it would. I'd take my hat off to you. I think that what you have displayed there is the kind of empathy that is missing in a lot of different newsrooms. Now, you can't teach empathy, unfortunately. I think one of the things that doesn't work is there can be all kinds of microaggressions and passive aggressive behavior from news organizations and from news leaders, pushing people too hard, not recognizing that people have got other things that they're dealing with at home, other challenges related to COVID that they might not have dealt with in the kind of pre-COVID environment, you know, perhaps homeschooling kids, perhaps caring for older relatives, perhaps living with extended families, perhaps feeling very isolated. What certainly doesn't work is sending emails in the middle of the night, which a lot of journalists and news leaders do. I think unless there's a way of framing it with saying, a signature perhaps saying, I'm sending this at a time convenient to me, please do not respond to this, please do not take this as urgent. So there are other ways of dealing with that. I think communication, effective communication in a way that is boundaried, in a way that recognizes that people are feeling overwhelmed is really important. Making things visible is really important in terms of what is available, and perhaps at different hours, not 9 to 5. And then one other thing I would say is communication is not a one-way street. Communication is not me talking to you and you listening the whole time. The most effective communication is often sitting there and really listening. So asking somebody, how are you? And actually making time to listen to their response. And if they don't respond verbally in a way that perhaps is convincing, find another way around it, because people might say, oh yeah, I'm fine, but actually maybe they're not. And I think that's really, really important. We can talk about this for hours in terms of what works and what doesn't, but hopefully some of that is quite helpful. And I think that just going back to the old newsroom cultures of, you know, working too many long hours, not having boundaries, and assuming that everybody else has that same kind of degree of privilege that you have, that doesn't help.
And I'd love to, yeah. Oh, thanks, Ian. Thanks. I just wanted to say a few words off the back of that, because that all I feel is absolutely right. You can't teach empathy, but you have to consider the position of those newsroom leaders and the situation that the news organization is in, because we all know journalism's got, you know, an issue around trying to stay sustainable in whatever form that is. Lots of news organizations have that at the top of their mind, as well as serving their audience as well, because obviously that's intrinsic to, you know, serve your audience as well. People will read, people will watch. So if there's pressure in that organization around, you know, financial pressures, threat of cuts, news editor's got to make a decision, then and you've got someone on a freelance contract who's feeling under pressure, that person's probably highly unlikely to say, I'm not feeling great today, because that means, okay, so you come off shift, I'll hire somebody else, you're not cut out for the job, so I'm going to have to get somebody else in. There's the threat of that there, really. And the fact that, you know, news organizations have to keep going. It's relentless. News is now relentless, and as much as organizations are providing people with the news as often as they can and updating stories as much as they can, whether that's, you know, digitally or, you know, every hour for your radio bulletins or 24-hour news, as much as editors want to keep providing the news, audiences expect it now. So the relentless nature of news means that it's going to be, it feels like it would be very difficult for a journalist to feel confident enough to go, whoa, I need to take the brakes off, because actually, hell no, the organization has got to keep going, because we've got to keep churning out. And if we lose you, we need someone else. So I think the threat of losing a job or not being seen as cut out for the job is the potential issue for the journalist. But also I definitely feel that leaders in news organizations need to be more Laura Collins, right?
Yeah.
And you know, to learn a lot from what you're doing, Laura, in terms of being empathetic. And if that means training, and that might be radical to, you know, some of those the kind of macho leaders that might still be there in our news organizations, that has to happen. But of course that has to come from the will of Society of Editors, you know, and those leaders in the BBC and ITN and all the rest of it.
We do see anecdotally that people are scared of coming forward, and there's a massive barrier there's still a massive stigma, taboo barrier, whatever phrase we want to use in terms of talking about mental health. I've spoken about my mental health issues earlier on this year, but it took me 10 years to do so. And I only did so because I had a degree of platform and privilege, which I recognised. I think that, you know, to Marverine's point, managers are struggling too. Managers are struggling too, and sometimes in different ways, and sometimes perhaps more so than they would make out. And I think that I had a conversation with somebody last week, and they said that one of the most helpful things that their newsroom managers had done was they communicated a degree of uncertainty. And they said, we can't be sure in this instance, we can't give you the guarantees and we can't give you the promises, but what we're prepared to do now is communicate with you in a way that shows you we are uncertain too. Now, we all cling to certainty and control in situations like this, right? But even being able to show that is really important, and also being able to take responsibility ourselves, because we have responsibility ourselves individually to look after ourselves in as far as we can. Same with managers. One of the other things I've heard, and I'll stop in a second, is that managers have felt a little bit like they are being asked to provide all the answers all the time in a way that they might not previously have had that kind of situation. So that's also a difficult kind of bridge for them to deal with.
I mean, Laura, before we make you a saint, I think we're too late. We've already made you one. But I mean, I'm guessing you can recognize this balancing act that you, I guess, have to do on a daily basis, where you've got all those pressures that Marverine has talked about. You know, the endless cost cutting, because, you know, let's be honest, you know, regional, local, national, all, you know, news organizations in general are, you know, are facing that. The pressure from consumers, from readers, from viewers, and yet you've got all the issues and the struggles that your staff may be having. I mean, how on earth do you reconcile that? I mean, is it possible for you, for, you know, on a day-to-day basis to have a reporter come to you and say, I'm sorry, I'm struggling right now, I've got to take a step back? I mean, how does that work, Laura?
So in terms of that working, I think, you know, I really like the point that Hannah and Marverine made about certainty and that uncertainty. And I think, you know, it's that expectation that at the end of the day, do you know what, we are all human, and we don't know all the answers. You know, I'm not a trained counsellor. I'm not trained in mental health, but what I am trained in is being a journalist and being a really good listener, and being really good at then being able to use my skills that I've got as a journalist in terms of, you know, probing, questioning, listening. And I think that's the kind of transferable skill that you can then bring into that situation. And I think it's having that ability to take that step back sometimes and say, do you know what, I don't know all the answers, but I am here if you need an ear. And I think that's really important at the moment, when everybody does feel so isolated. And, you know, it's recognizing that people do put their head above the parapet and they do come forward, and actually it's having that empathy and being able to listen to that individual, take what's happening and isolate it from the bigger picture as well, because you can't treat everybody with the same broad brushstroke, can you? Everybody has to be treated as an individual, and sometimes, do you know what, that best thing might be for that individual to take a little bit of time out and to actually look after themselves. Because I think, you know, it's really easy, as Marvine said, in terms of, you know, news is relentless, it's always happening, it's 24/7 now, people expect it all the time, but sometimes you have to take that time to look after yourself and switch off for the good of it as well.
Well, that brings us on maybe to my final question. And by the way, attendees, if you want to just, and thank you for those of you that have already been putting some questions into the chat, we're going to come to those in a moment. Those of you who still got a question, maybe if you want to put that into the chat now, that would be great. But just my final question is really that, because some of the attendees on our call today are aspiring journalists, and I'm just conscious that perhaps some of them are thinking, oh my goodness, what on earth am I signing myself up for here? We don't want to send them off in despair, because we all love journalism. You know, we love what we do, but we want to make it better, and we want it to make it a better place in which to work. So, how should we, and maybe I'll come to you, Marverine, as a director of undergraduate journalism programs first, but what should we be teaching the next generation of journalists, as well as the inverted pyramid and media law and all that kind of stuff? But I mean, what should we be telling them, in those early days about protecting their own mental health?
I can only speak from my personal perspective and what I do and what I encourage my team of lecturers to do when they're teaching students every day, is just reminding students that if they're losing focus somehow in their learning, that they really have to find a way of reminding themselves of their motivation. Why are you here on the course? Because I think, if you genuinely don't feel a huge passion for this profession, it's probably not for you. And I say that to potential candidates when they come to open days and applicant taster days. I say, you really gotta live, eat and breathe news. And that doesn't mean that you have to be someone who wants to be an investigative journalist and wants to doorstep people, because I was never that person, but I knew I loved news right before I even started studying. But as long as you love what's going on in the world and you always want to be on top of what is happening in the world, then you're in the right place. I think it's going to be tricky for you if you don't feel that, but I'm sure other people might say different. I feel that, and I kind of communicate that to my students every day. But what we also do is ensure that we're giving praise in the right area, because students need to feel that they have a level of self-confidence around their work. So I am very keen on praising where it's needed, not overpraising, but just reminding a student that they're doing well, or they're kind of excelling in a particular area, and reminding themselves that they have learned well and that they have that knowledge. Because part of that self-confidence is it's linked to inner resilience. I think we've all got inner resilience, just need to find it. And if you're not praised in the right way by a tutor, you're not going to know whether or not you're any good, right? So I don't overuse it, but praise is really important. I'm also really real with them about how the experiences that I've had in the profession, but also the fact that they have to be super alert, and they have to kind of process information very, very quickly. Potentially, depending on, obviously if you're on a daily news desk, yeah, absolutely. You've got to be a bit of a go-getter. You've got to be ready to accept that rejection is probably the default position, because, depending on who you're asking, you might have to ask 10 people, to get 5 decent voxes or whatever, or stand in the rain for hours to try and speak to people. You got to be ready for that. So I'm very honest with them about situations that they could be in, and also I'm very honest with them around, there's going to be great moments where you might be able to interview some kind of random celeb that turns up somewhere, or there's so much fun, but there's also a lot of craziness. So I'm very, very honest with them about what they should be prepared for, and we try and kind of give them timed tasks and real world situations. Every journalism course there's news days, so I push to get them to work faster and all that sort of thing. And ultimately, particularly for students on this panel now, I would say, if you're feeling like this is all too much and I'm not sure about whether this is right for me, I think you really have to have a think about whether or not it is, because journalism has to be the itch that you have to scratch, right? That's why I got into the business, right? It has to be. And if it isn't, it's probably not for you, because you're not going to be able to withstand the ups and downs, the highs and lows, the rejections, and it's probably not going to work out.
Thank you. Yeah, go on.
Can I just add something? Sorry, I think what Marverine said is brilliant, is absolutely brilliant, because journalism is a lifestyle choice. It's a vocation. You're never going to be a millionaire being a journalist. So if you think you're going to be a millionaire, then you're probably in the wrong job. But the point of the matter is, I think that maybe we need to reframe the discussion around strength and weakness. And I think perhaps we need to look at, this kind of macho stuff, which is not necessarily strong, and you don't have to be tough to be a journalist. Okay, you have to be resilient, and you have to be able to recover, and you have to be passionate as well, and you have to be a great listener, as Laura said. But I think that sometimes being able to admit vulnerability, and I recognize that in some instances people can't, I recognize that can actually be a strength. And being able to set your boundaries and say no sometimes earns a degree more respect than actually constantly saying yes, and being kind of left in the gutter because you're exhausted, etc., etc. So that's really important. And I think that everything that Marverine said is really, really critical, but it still is an absolutely amazing profession that'll take you places and introduce you to people that very few other professions do. And it's one that will connect you with brilliant, wonderful people in a space where generally there's a great deal of solidarity and encouragement and a great deal of resilience. So I think let's not underestimate how good journalism is, but let's also not underestimate the hill we have to climb in terms of addressing mental health in a better way.
Sure, thank you, Hannah. I'm just going to dive into these questions because a couple of our attendees have kind of talked about what we've just been mentioning there, which is this idea that is there an exceptionalism about journalism? Is journalism just a very different profession, or is it actually the same as others? So Claudia, for instance, how is this different from other professions? Some of the things we're discussing, social media, organizations paying lip service, lack of diversity, are perhaps common to other professions. So that's Claudia. But then let me see, Haley says, do you think journalists at some degree need to have a deeper level of toughness to survive in this field compared to other professions? And then Margaret's saying, I wonder if there is an exceptionalism around journalism. How does this profession differ in really meaningful and significant ways from many others? I wonder if law lecturers tell their students that they need to eat and sleep the law, I guess in the way that we've been saying they should eat and sleep news. So, are we right to make an exception of journalism, or is this really just, if we were to have a call about another industry sector, we would probably be talking about something, much the same kind of issues and challenges. I don't know if anybody wants to take that one on. Anthony, please, yes, if you want to unmute yourself, Anthony.
I won't speak to journalism directly, but other professions are very challenging. I mean, medicine is an enormously challenging profession, and you live and eat and sleep medicine. You work very long hours. You do night calls. You're up all night. You work the next day. You're dealing with life and death issues. So I think all professions are going to have their stresses and their pressures, particularly if you want to do it well and to the best of your ability. So I would be careful about making exceptions with respect to certain professions. The whole question of resilience, I think, intrigues me a lot, because we've spoken a lot about trauma and emotional health right now, and it's great to have this discussion. But the other side of the coin is that my data has shown consistently over many years that the majority of journalists do not have incapacitating anxiety or severe depression or PTSD. They manage it very well despite all these pressures. But the minority who develop these problems is a substantial one. It's a bigger minority than perhaps you'd see in the general population. And so this is where the focus has to be, on those individuals who are struggling with what is clearly a very difficult time in your profession. But one has to keep a sense of perspective. The entire profession is not traumatized. The majority of journalists are not succumbing to major mental health difficulties, because if they were, your profession would collapse. The kinds of things that we speak about now bring people down very hard. Anxiety is not some kind of abstract thing. I mean, when you've got a significant anxiety disorder, you can become dysfunctional from it. And so one has to see the data in this context. I think you are a tough profession. I think you are resilient, and that's why you survive so long and do your great work. But one shouldn't lose sight of those individuals who, with no fault of their own, have difficulties with this. And we have to address the sensitivity and understanding. Don't victimize them for a second time. Don't try and get rid of the stigma that's attached to that. That's the huge challenge.
Thank you, Anthony. A comment here from Chris. It's very difficult, as in a normal world, we would leave home to go to work, then return back to our homes, our safe space. Now we're bringing that stress into our safe space. I feel okay at the moment, but I am aware that others would be in a difficult situation. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Chris. And then Nick has an interesting question. I'm not sure if we're able to answer this one, Nick, but Nick works for the Xinhua news agency in Israel, and Nick's asking, I'm wondering, what do you think could be done about high-ranking politicians' psychological pressure on journalists? And he's quoting the example here in Israel of the Prime Minister himself slamming personally journalists, sometimes blaming them baselessly with regards to corruption and promoting a coup, and it's causing a major stress to some journalists. And of course, I guess we've seen that, certainly, haven't we, in the Trump White House. Panelists, I mean, I don't know, this is probably outside our remit, but any thoughts on that kind of pressure? Hannah, thank you.
Just very briefly, I mean, we've seen it in lots of different countries around the world. We've seen it in Turkey, we've seen it in the Philippines, we've seen it in Central Eastern Europe, we've seen it in the States, we've seen it to a degree in the UK as well. And I think that one of the things that does help in this instance is, and maybe this sounds incredibly trite, but a degree of solidarity. So pushing back as a broader organization or industry against that, recognizing that our role as journalists, and I run something called the Ethical Journalism Network, is holding power to account. And that is trying to undermine journalists' accountability when people do that. So pushing back and proving that that is not acceptable, and suggesting that that is not acceptable might sound like a really simple, perhaps trite answer, but I think it does work in some space.
Totally agree, Hannah. When you only have to look at what happens when Trump kind of goes fake news, and CNN and NBC will fight back and support their journalists. I think there needs to be a lot more of that here, particularly when, the two cases of the brilliant journalists who I mentioned at the start of this panel, Rihanna and Ben, need a lot more support publicly from their employers. I think, that the NUJ comes out and supports journalists. Clearly they should, and they would as a union, but employers really need to, as far as they can, because it's upholding our democracy. Journalism is about holding power to account. So it shouldn't be allowed to be pressured and blamed and harassed in the way that they are.
Just picking up on what you said there, Marverine, attacks on journalism really is undermining that democratic way of life. And I think, what we've seen, particularly with coronavirus and the sort of unfolding crisis that we're in, that, journalism really does matter, and that trusted news is more important than ever as we try and navigate our way through what's happening and continue to make sense of it. So actually, I think this is a really, really crucial time for journalism.
Fantastic. Well, we are almost out of time. All that remains for me to do is really to say thank you so much, panelists, for joining us today, for being so willing to share your time and your experience and your expertise with us. So thank you very much for that. To our audience, many thanks for joining us today for this event that we provided for free. We hope that you found it informative and helpful. And just as part of that, I'm just going to copy and paste into the chat function. Oh, it hasn't worked. Doesn't hyperlink. Sorry, those were all meant to be hyperlinked, but never mind. I will send out a link, an email to all attendees this evening, just with some links to resources that we've mentioned today, and maybe some others as well. So hopefully you'll find that helpful. The other thing I would really find helpful is if you would tell me what events you'd like to see next. We're coming near the end of our autumn season of events here at Civic Journalism Lab, but I would really find it helpful if you would just click that link, and you'll be able to answer a few questions that will just give me an idea of the sort of events and masterclasses and so on that you might like to us to cover in future weeks. So thank you so much to Laura, to Marverine, to Hannah, to Anthony, And to you all for joining us today, thank you and have a good evening.